All right, hey y'all, welcome back. This is going to be Chapter 30, Political Economic Cycles by Robert Franzese and Karen Longhusco. Really interesting chapter. Um, we're basically talking about what incentives do leaders have to sort of rig the economy right before or after an election to please voters and try and get either reelected to get reelected, basically, right? So, the assumption here again, we're looking at this lens through incentives, right? This course through incentives. So here we sort of assuming that politicians, first of all, have an incentive to get reelected, um, and that politicians have an incentive to boost the economy just before an election due to sort of economic preferences, right, of the voters. Um, and so you'll see sort of widespread redistributive programs from this sort of electioneering perspective. And then there's the partisaneering perspective, which is basically the same thing, except it distinguishes by saying that the goods that are given out by the party in power or the coalition in power in a prime minister system, the goods that are given out will be more specific based on their own party members, right? And so, in this sort of the electioneering picture, you have widespread redistribution just before an election. You want to basically uh, pump money in the system. It will create inflation, but it'll drop unemployment, and you should get some production and GDP boost, right? Which should look good. Whereas in partisaneering, it's the same thing, except you're giving the goods to your own people, your own party members, basically. So we have a kind of a couple questions. Um, how do we explain the government's choices when deciding what policies to implement? This is the basic question in the chapter, okay? And the authors suggest that there's really three things that we're missing here, because a lot of the former literature says, yeah, theoretically, this makes a lot of sense, but we're not finding any statistical evidence for it really anywhere, right? Not in developing countries, not in developed countries, not in the OECD, not in Europe. And so, they said some authors would find some evidence for it, but it was weak or it was only in specific countries, and they didn't really understand what's going on because theoretically it's such a strong sort of logic. And so the authors say, all right, well, there's three things that we need to look at, right? International and domestic variation, political and economic variation, and institutional, structural, and strategic context, right? And it's all about basically context here. And that there are variations across policies and countries and times that sort of restrict a government's ability to enact these sort of policies, right? So, it depends on popular demands for economic policy. The left versus the right are going to be pushing for different economic policies, as we'll talk about later. There's also the sort of re-election incentives and the partisan incentives, right? The closer an election gets, the bigger the promises get, and the more likely and the more sort of necessary a politician feels to try to jig the economy, right? Whereas if it's not really a competitive election, you don't have to make those sorts of promises or enact those sort of policies. Who has control of the policy, right? Is there sort of independent central bank controlling things? Does the Fed sort of have its own powers? Are you linked to an international currency, right? Have you dollarized your nation basically? Um, are there checks and balances in the system that ensure that just one party or one leader cannot just enact financial decisions and tax decisions, things of that sort, without checks and balances, right? And so, um, from that perspective, the more sort of prime ministers, right, should have more power because, at least here in the United States system, we have a president, we have the legislature, and we have the Supreme Court, all of which can sort of check each other, right? But in many prime ministerships, there's basically just the legislature, and it's generally run by one party or a coalition that can just pass whatever legislation they want as long as they don't lose voters. And so, in the United States, it would be harder to have these sort of jigging of the economy, at least pre-election, as we'll talk about later, than in other sort of Westminster systems, right? Okay, so yeah, as we sort of talked about earlier, like small, wimpy states, right? Small states with small economies, they're going to be less likely to participate in this sort of behavior, right? First of all, because they don't have a lot of purchasing power, they probably don't have a lot of tax collection. Their GDP is very low, and so they can't really implement this policy as well as a developed state can. Um, But large states should have more incentive to behave this way, and they have more efficacy to behave this way, right? And we do find that larger states tend to participate these more than smaller states. So again, I mean, back to their main thesis, it's all about context, right? Um, Political economic cycles should occur, but they shouldn't all be as strong as each other, right? And some nations might not experience them for different contextual reasons. And over time, there might be different contextual reasons for how this works, right? All right, so we'll jump into electoral cycles basically. And we'll have to talk about the model, and then we'll talk about sort of the research and the findings. So we jump right into part 2.1, which is the Nordhaus model, all right? And the idea here is that economic actors sort of expect rates of inflation that are past rates, right? So um, it's based on the Phillips curve idea, and the Phillips curve basically just says that as you pump money into the system and you reduce unemployment, right, because productivity is increasing, and you reduce unemployment, the sort of inevitable trade-off that you pay is higher inflation because companies feel that they can increase their prices. Wage demands are going up. Labor is becoming more difficult to find. That pushes wage up, etc. Right? And so there's this inevitable trade-off that you have between inflation and unemployment. Um, I would say right now, economists are a bit confused. Like, what the hell's going on? We have both incredibly low inflation, not low inflation, excuse me, incredibly low unemployment and increasingly falling inflation, which is wonderful news, right? Um, but economists are kind of confused as to and impressed by how the Fed and I guess the Biden administration have handled the inflation crisis. So everybody's talking about sort of a soft landing. The GDP is exploding over the last half year. Unemployment is way low, and yet inflation keeps dropping. So um, this is going to take time to understand, right? It'll probably take another 10 years or more to really understand what the hell happened with this sort of administration and how they manage things. But it's been an interesting thing to watch. Um, So I would say take the Phillips curve with a little bit of a grain of salt. But this is a logic that stuck together for many, many years. And this is sort of the approach that at least sort of a Thatcher administration in England and the Reagan administration in the United States during the 1980s fought sort of the stagflation problem and the inflation problems of the 1970s um, through the Phillips curve model logic, right? And so, though we are having some problems with it this day, um, there's still that really basic core logic that is still pretty strong. Um, so this should lead basically to stimulus before an election, right? At least from an electioneering perspective, you have an incentive as a politician to try and jig the economy to boost your sort of opinion ratings and to be re-voted into office. However, the sort of statistics and the research, like we talked about, are a bit mixed. But we do find much more evidence for sort of the contextual approach, right? So Nordhaus in 75, finds that there are only political economic cycles in 3 of the 9 nations he looked at, but he did say that in those 3, basically what was happening is it was about context, and they either had a unified executive, like we talked about earlier, the Westminster system, or they had really tight elections that made the politicians on both sides promise there'd be more and try to um, um, catch those independent voters who were swing. um, excuse me. And policy autonomy, right? How many checks and balances are there in your system? And so those things were sort of the contextual variables that Nordhaus points out. And Franzese in 2002 further argues that we don't really find these at the macro level because the problem is that they're being doled out at sort of the micro level. We're not seeing big explosions in, say, just social safety nets, right? So that we have this idea of like a UBI, right, the Universal Basic Income, which presidential candidate Andrew Yang was pushing, the UBI, which has been instituted in a couple sort of northern European states, but and there are experiments actually in the United States in some major urban areas. But anyway, Franzese finds that we don't really find these at the macro level because what's happening is they're just being doled out to their voters, like we talked a little bit about earlier, through things like money transfers and tax cuts and sort of tax benefits, right, for the wealthy and for lobbyists. Public works projects, which usually lead to sort of huge lower middle class hiring boom, right, which can be really helpful right before an election, and then government hiring, right. And then I also would add, we talked about in the last chapter by Suzanne Lohman, the idea that people are retiring, right, and so you're seeing this huge expansion of the social safety net in many states, but only for the elderly, right? Because not only is their voting bloc getting bigger as more retirees sort of enter that retirement age, but we also know that the older a voter gets, the more likely they are to vote, as long as they're not 102, where your body just starts to fall apart. You literally can't get to the polls. But we do know that the elderly tend to vote at extremely high rates, not only in the United States but in many other countries. And so you're seeing many of these parties try and push these policies toward the elderly rather than redistribution programs toward other segments of the population, I guess I would say. Okay. Um, There's also this idea that parties might have a strategic timing incentive. There's not really a lot of evidence, but the idea is that when your GDP is expanding, you might jump in and call your early elections. And we talked about that earlier in the semester too, where um, there's this sort of inevitable pushback by voters saying, okay, but now we're skeptical. Why did you call them early? This is the best the economy is going to look like, right? And so there's pushback from voters. And oftentimes when you call early elections, public opinion polls fall for the party or the government that called the election. And so that's why we don't really see much statistical evidence for this idea, though there are research papers that say it happened, in Japan and in India. So I'll let you read that. The also Another contextual approach is, the idea that there's internal checks and balances, like we talked about in the United States. Um, there are multiple kind of ways that it'll weaken the party in power's ability to enact these sort of stimulus or economic rejigging programs just before an election. Um, and these include what they call common pool problems. So there's multiple basically agencies in control of budgets. There's veto players, right? So there's the Senate in the United States. There's the Senate, and you have to get past a filibuster Senate at this point. 61 votes or more. There's also the House of Representatives, where you have to have a majority, and then there's the president who has veto power, and then there's the court system, which can stop a program quickly if they need to. And so the more sort of veto players there are, the less power a party in power will be able to do this. So if you imagine the United States, however, um, if you say that right now the Supreme Court is very Republican, say the Republicans take the House and the presidency and the Senate, which could actually happen in 2024, that will sort of reduce the number of checks and balances that exist in the system, right? And so potentially Trump, if he won, because we know he's going to be the candidate, would have more power to sort of enact this political economic cycle approach because there are fewer checks and balances, right? So I guess, envisioning the future in the American context, that's what it would look like. Um, Let's see. Oh, independent central banks are very important, right? If you could just push the independent central bank around, obviously that can be a really bad thing for the economy, as we've seen in many developing countries, especially where politicians have a lot more control over like how much money is printed and what the inflation interest rates are, and those sorts of things. Whereas in a lot of developed countries, we know that these are very, very strongly held independent positions that are it, at least sort of theoretically supposed to be very independent from politics, right? So um, let's see. They also, I guess, in sort of the closing arguments of this section, they say that they find more evidence for post-electoral political economic cycles rather than pre-electoral, right? Especially in close elections. And so, what they explain happening here is that a credible challenger, like we talked about a little bit earlier, will force both the challenger and the incumbent to make much bigger sort of promises, right? And so what will happen is after an election, when you have a huge political mandate, you've just been elected, people are sky high about you, your opinion polls are always at their very peak, almost always, excluding like 9/11, basically, with George Bush. But almost inevitably, your opinion polls are at their peak just pre-election or post-election, excuse me. And so you've had to ramp up all your promises to whether you're the incumbent or the challenger to your voters, basically. And so you'll have to meet those promises just after being elected, which that sort of 100-day period that we know about. Um, you do see that in a lot of societies. And so we find a lot more evidence for that sort of approach than we do the pre-election approach. And I'm not saying the pre-election approach doesn't exist. It's just much more difficult, right? Because once you enter I don't know, the statistics say like in your 30th month, that's when you have your nadir, you're bottoming out as a president in opinion polls in your 30th month. So, imagine you're in your 30th month, you're looking forward to elections, but your opinion polls are low. Um, you've already pissed off different segments of your sort of your group, right? Whether you're Republican or liberal, like no matter what you do, you're gonna frustrate someone, some voters, some donor groups, some lobbyists, because that's sort of the inevitability in politics. You have to pass policy, and not everyone's going to be happy about it, right? And so these polls and these your mandate dropping and sort of pissed off followers and lobbyists and donors, of course, it makes pre-election engineering more difficult than post-election engineering, right? So, okay, we'll move on. Part 3: partisan cycles. It's just the idea that again, it's contextual, and that we're going to see a lot more behavior in a partisan way than we are in sort of a huge electioneering way where everyone gets benefits, right? And so we have to shift to a more partisan approach. Um, the incentives here, right? Parties have an incentive to provide benefits to their parties, and they'll generally converge on the median voter. There are a couple problems with this approach, right? There can be incomplete information about who the median voter is. Um, and so you're going to get more of a regression toward the political platform, right? But we do know that basically different groups have different incentives. The lower classes, at least under theory, and we do find statistical evidence for this, the lower classes should be a lot more of accepting of inflation rather than unemployment, because they're much more likely to lose their job than the rich, while the rich will be much more frustrated with inflation than unemployment because they tend to keep their jobs at higher rates, and also inflation tends to eat at their assets that the lower classes just don't have. And so the distribution of wealth in society can be important if you have huge underclasses. The potential for sort of this democratic behavior, or the liberal side, pushing higher growth and lower unemployment but higher inflation, you should see those policies. Rather, on the Republican side, or a conservative government in Europe, what you should see is lower inflation but higher unemployment, um, and lower growth. And that is exactly what we see in the United States. There's about a 1.5 to 2% greater unemployment level under Republicans, and a 5 to 6% lower growth rate under Republicans than under Democrats, but higher inflation rates, right, under Democrats. And under Republicans, not only is there greater unemployment and lower growth, um, and lower inflation, um, but there's also a lot more inequality. And so we see more inequality under conservative administrations than we do under Democratic administrations. So, okay, that's all I got for you today. I'm glad you stuck with me. Some really interesting stuff about, you know, watch your politicians and watch their actions just before and just after an election. Um, and you'll see them trying to sort of jig things in their favor, right? So, anyway, have a great day. I'll see you for the next chapter, which will be, might as well let you know, uh, chapter 33, Capitalism and Democracy by Torben Iversen of Harvard University, and formerly of the London School of Economics, which is one of the best. I'd say there's really three economic institutions. I don't know why I'm telling you. It's probably NYU, London School of Economics, um, and Chicago University economics program. Those are top three in the world. So anyway, have a great day. I will see you for the next one. Thanks for being here.